floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me, Madam, to begin by congratulating you for your country's presidency at the head of the Council's work this month. I would also like to thank these speakers who have briefed us this morning. Madam President, the Syrian government continues to do everything possible to shoulder its responsibility and its duty towards its people to meet the humanitarian needs and the basic needs of our citizens. And this, despite economic, political, and media pressure, including, of course, unilateral and arbitrary measures, economic measures, that have been imposed by some states, members of this international organization, against the Syrian people, in addition to pressure exerted on the Syrian economy and the manipulation of our national currency. In addition as well to the pursuit of support given to armed terrorist groups entering Syria through our borders from neighboring countries in order to become involved in acts of destruction, terrorism, and violence, and to destroy all means of survival for Syrian citizens, destroy our infrastructures, our harvests, and the provision of humanitarian assistance. The Syrian government has participated effectively and seriously in negotiations which have led to the adoption of the 5th Humanitarian Support Plan to maintain constructive cooperation with the United Nations system and to deal with the humanitarian consequences of the events in a positive and pragmatic way. We welcome an extension of the objectives under the plan, under the assistance plan, and projects aimed at supporting the Syrian government and helping them to revitalize key sectors and rebuild our infrastructure, which has systematically been targeted by terrorist groups, armed terrorist groups. Allow me, Madam President, to speak about some measures taken by the Syrian government since the last briefing of the Council. The competent authorities of the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, in an attempt to coordinate our national and international efforts to provide full international assistance to all those who deserve that assistance, these authorities established a high committee for aid through national committees to bring displaced families back to their homes or by providing them temporary housing in order to meet their basic needs and to provide them the necessary financial assistance. Until the 17th of June 2013, the government of Syria set up some 803 temporary housing units throughout Syria. These centers have social centers, schools, governmental buildings. The number of displaced families is now some 918,000 families displaced throughout the territory of the country. There are also other governmental committees dealing with reconstruction for those who have seen their property destroyed. This committee also helps rehabilitate and maintain the infrastructure as well as public buildings, a number of government buildings as well. The government has also taken measures to facilitate the work of United Nations agencies in providing relief by increasing the number of NGOs by 14, in addition to the 82 national organizations working throughout the territory. We have allowed international organizations to carry out some 200 visits to assess needs and to provide assistance. There are 3 hubs, and the government is also considering the opening of other additional hubs, in addition to the work carried out by the World Food Programme. Madam President, the cooperation of the Syrian government with the United Nations is governed by the United Nations Charter and the Resolution 46/182, as well as the guiding principles and the humanitarian relief, or the revised humanitarian relief plan. The government is fully committed to working within this framework. However, the government at the same time is asking the Secretariat of the United Nations and the member states to show the same level of respect for the Charter and full respect for the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic and the territorial integrity of this country. Madam President, dealing with civilians should not be done in a selective, opportunistic, or politicized manner. Statements to the effect that there are some 2,500 individuals trapped in homes when the Syrian government is ensuring their security, making sure that they have humanitarian relief, and is doing everything possible to open up this area and free it from terrorist actions. This should not divert our attention from the blockade imposed by armed terrorist groups on hundreds of thousands of inhabitants in Syria. We haven't heard any comment on this issue from the United Nations. With regard to the humanitarian tragedy caused by armed terrorist groups and those who support these groups, including member states of our organization. For example, we have the towns of Noble and El Zahara, which have been under blockade for more than a year. That blockade has been imposed by terrorist groups, armed terrorist groups, entering the Syrian territory through our border with Turkey. 2 million civilians in Aleppo, don't they also deserve a mention from the Secretariat of the United Nations when they are suffering from terrorist imposed by extremist terrorist groups known to everyone through the social media, including Al-Qaeda? The villages of Noble and Zahara, don't they deserve some response, even limited response from the United Nations in order to break this blockade? Interest shown in the thousands of people living in homes when hundreds of thousands of people are being ignored throughout the territory in the north of Syria. Let me come back to Homs, ladies and gentlemen. The government of Syria has made a formal invitation to the International Committee of the Red Cross to provide emergency relief in cooperation with the Arab Syrian International Red Crescent to help these individuals under blockade in the old city of Homs because they are being used by the armed terrorist groups.
موقفهم حول إدخال المساعدات الإنسانية عبر
Some of those in the United Nations justify their determination to provide humanitarian relief through international borders by maintaining that the government has not provided assistance to all regions. The figures and the statistics speak for themselves. The World Food Programme statistics, as well as the statistics of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the statistics of the ICRC, 60% of assistance is being given to regions where the armed terrorist groups are operating, and yet 40% alone is sent to other regions. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees on the 23rd of May 2013 referred to 14 UN convoys, joint convoys of the United Nations to gaining access to hot spots which had not been opened before, including to provide assistance to some 975,000 individuals in Homs, Aleppo, and Idlib, to mention but a few. Anasheba, Madamiyat al-Sham, and Doma around Damascus, and El Mayadin al-Riyazur. According to UN sources, 10 convoys have been sent to some 1 million inhabitants during the first half of the year. Azaz, Karam, Bab al-Hawa, and Atma have received assistance along the Turkish border, as well as Tel Bisa in Homs and Sermin in the governorate of Idlib. Madam President, lack of financing continues to be a major handicap for implementing the relief plan. In point of fact, after the United Nations institutions and its partners in the humanitarian field launched a major humanitarian appeal quite recently, we are surprised that so far financing has only reached 35% of the amount earmarked for the implementation of this relief plan. In accordance with OCHA's report, if financing is not forthcoming in time, basic relief needed for survival will be jeopardized by the beginning of September. Displaced Syrian persons continue to return home on a regular basis, in particular refugees in neighboring areas neighboring the border. I would like to refer to some of the documentation of the United Nations and comments made in particular by the UNHCR, namely a reference to the voluntary return of thousands of Syrians from Jordan, Syria, Iraq. Some 68,000 individuals have returned to Syria, 9,000 of them
من العراق.
To the al-Azadi camp. Some 45,000 have come from Turkey and 9,000 from Iraq. We regret the fact that some governments have denied, withdrawn the identification papers of Syrians to prevent them from returning to their country. And worse yet, these individuals have been intimidated and dissuaded from returning voluntarily to their homes. Madam President, the diplomatic, political machine, and the media give us false figures as to the number of deceased prisoners and refugees in Syria. These statistics, these figures, come from unprofessional sources. Moreover, an American company has been entrusted officially with preparing these statistics. Although this company is associated with states, its association is well known to Syria, these institutions are not interested in knowing where every refugee comes from, or where every refugee has been killed, or whether or not the Syrian Arab Army or the armed forces have done the killing. We in our country are facing unprecedented terrorism from extremist groups which have come from all four corners of the earth to displace and to kill Syrians. This is a historic phase in our country which calls for courage to recognize the reality. We are facing cross-border terrorists in our country in our efforts to combat terrorism. We are seeing a new face of terrorism, Madam President. This face of terrorism is quite different. Some call it jihad, garsant, others call it unarmed struggle, and others still call it sexual jihad. This terrorism is transnational. It has a negative effect on everyone, and this is well known to the member states of this organization. Today, opposition forces intend to declare an Islamic Syrian state in the north of Syria by the end of the month of Ramadan. These terrorists who come from abroad, who come through our common borders with Turkey, have Takfirist and Salafist tendencies. They're jihadists, and they're sponsored by governmental forces hostile to Syria, financing terrorism because only Syrians are killed. However, this terrorism will come to the doors of those who sponsor terrorism. This has already been the case for some states. If member states of the United Nations do not recognize the dangers of this type of terrorism, then there will not be peace for anyone. And the day will come when the governments of some member states will regret their actions against the Syrian people from a social, economic, and infrastructure standpoint. Ladies and gentlemen, we are fighting for the entire world. We are combating Salafist terrorism, which others have had to fight in Afghanistan, in Mali, in Niger, in Nigeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Libya, and in Tunisia. This is the terrorism we are facing today in Syria. It is not dissociated from terrorism, which we are all facing. Weapons in Libya come through official convoys, in planes, in ships, landing in neighboring states, member states of this organization. Some say that there are 2,500 individuals in homes that the Security Council needs to intervene to save them. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians are suffering from terrorism. That is today's reality. Thank you, Madam.